On an April morning in 1975, in the mud of the Lancaster County livestock auction, a 28-year-old widow named Helen Marlowe learned two things that would change her life forever. She learned what cruelty looked like when it wore expensive boots and laughed at a woman in the dirt, and she learned what kindness looked like when it knelt beside her and offered a hand. Helen had come to the auction 3 weeks after burying her husband, Jack. 3 weeks after watching them lower his coffin into the cold Nebraska earth. 3 weeks after standing alone in a farmhouse that suddenly felt too big, too quiet, too full of a man who wasn't coming back. Jack Marlowe had died the way too many farmers died, under a tractor, on a frozen hillside, trying to do one more job before the light failed. He was 32 years old. They had been married for 6 years. They had built a small cattle operation together. 180 acres, about 90 head of Hereford cattle. Nothing fancy but theirs. Now it was just Helen's. And Helen had a problem. She had no debt. Jack had been careful about that, but she had no cash either. Everything they'd earned had gone back into the operation. The cattle were healthy. The fences were good. The land was paid for. But the property taxes were due in June. The feed bill was due at the end of the month. The veterinarian needed paying. Helen needed money, and the only way to get money was to sell some cattle. She didn't want to sell them all, just enough to get through the year, to buy herself time to figure out what came next. Maybe 20 head, maybe 30, enough to pay the bills and keep the operation alive until she could decide whether to keep farming or sell out entirely. So on that cold April morning, Helen Marlowe put on her black mourning dress, the same dress she'd worn to Jack's funeral, and drove to the Lancaster County livestock auction. She had no idea what was waiting for her. Now let me tell you about Garrett Holloway, because every tragedy needs a villain, and Garrett had been practicing for the role his entire life. Garrett Holloway was the biggest cattle operator in Lancaster County. Not because he was the best, but because he was the most ruthless. His father had left him 400 acres and a modest herd By 1975, Garrett had expanded to over 3,000 acres and 800 head of cattle, buying out neighbors one by one, always at prices that favored him. His favorite targets were widows. When a rancher died, Garrett moved fast. He knew that widows were vulnerable, overwhelmed by grief, unfamiliar with the business side of ranching, desperate for cash. He would show up at their doors with sympathy and lowball offers. If they came to auction, he had another strategy. The buyer's ring. A buyer's ring is an illegal agreement among bidders to suppress prices. Instead of competing against each other, the members of the ring agree not to bid, letting one member buy at an artificially low price. Later they hold a private auction among themselves and split the difference. Garrett had been running a buyer's ring at Lancaster County livestock auctions for over a decade. The county sheriff knew about it. The auction house knew about it. Nobody did anything because Garrett had money and power and the kind of friends who looked the other way. When Garrett heard that Jack Marlowe's widow was bringing cattle to auction, he saw an opportunity. But there was something else. Something that made Helen's cattle more valuable than she knew. Let me tell you about Red Duke. Because without understanding that bull, you can't understand why Garrett Holloway was willing to push a widow into the mud. Red Duke was a 3-year-old Hereford bull that Jack Marlowe had bought at auction 2 years earlier. He'd paid $800 for him, more than he could really afford, but something about the animal had caught his eye. Jack had a gift for seeing potential in livestock. It was almost supernatural. He could look at a young bull and somehow know what it would become. His neighbors thought he was crazy for paying $800 for an unproven animal, but Jack had started keeping records. In a leather notebook that he kept in his desk drawer, Jack Marlowe documented everything about Red Duke's offspring: the birth weights, the weaning weights, the rate of gain, the temperament, the conformation. The numbers were extraordinary. Red Duke's calves gained weight 15% faster than the county average. They were healthier, hardier, more docile. 2 of them had already been sold as breeding stock to ranchers in Kansas, who reported back that the genetics were exceptional. Jack Marlowe had stumbled onto a gold mine. A bull with genetics like Red Duke's could be worth $20,000, maybe $30,000 to the right buyer. The calves alone could command premium prices for years to come. Jack had been planning to build his entire operation around Red Duke. He'd told Helen about it, shown her the notebook, explained what it meant for their future. Then he died, and Helen, lost in grief, forgot about the notebook in the desk drawer. But Garrett Holloway hadn't forgotten. Garrett had sources everywhere, at the feed store, at the veterinarian's office, at the auction house. He'd heard rumors about Jack Marlowe's bull, about the exceptional calves, about the records being kept. He'd tried to buy Red Duke from Jack directly, but Jack had refused. Now Jack was dead, and his widow was bringing cattle to auction, including Garrett hoped that bull. On the morning of the auction, Garrett gathered his buyer's ring in the parking lot of the sale barn. "Listen up," he said, his breath fogging in the cold air. "The Marlowe widow's got about 30 head coming through today. Some of those are Red Duke calves, you know what that means. Nobody bids against me. Nobody. Let her take whatever I offer, or let her take them home. Either way, we break her." "What if she won't sell?" one of the men asked. Garrett smiled. "She'll sell. She's got no choice. And if she makes trouble," he shrugged. "A widow alone? Who's going to help her?" Let me tell you about Thomas Ashford, because this story needs a hero as much as it needs a villain. Thomas was 30 years old, the owner of a small ranch about 10 miles from Helen's place. He'd inherited 200 acres from his father 5 years earlier and had been slowly building it up, working harder than any two men, staying clear of debt, doing things the right way. He knew about Garrett Holloway's buyer's ring. Everyone knew. But Thomas was too small a player to matter. Garrett didn't see him as competition, so Thomas had never been invited to join and had never been targeted. Thomas had known Jack Marlowe slightly. They'd talked a few times at the feed store, compared notes on cattle prices, shared the easy camaraderie of men doing the same hard work. He'd liked Jack, respected him. When Thomas heard that Jack had died, he'd thought about driving over to offer his condolences to the widow. He'd even gotten in his truck once, driven halfway there, then turned around. What would he say? He barely knew them. It would seem strange. But when he heard that Helen Marlowe was bringing cattle to auction, and when he heard the rumors about what Garrett was planning, Thomas decided to come to the sale barn. Not to buy anything, just to watch. Just in case. Now let me tell you about the auction, because this is where everything changed. Helen arrived at the sale barn at 9 a.m., an hour before her cattle were scheduled to go through the ring. She'd trailered the animals herself, 30 head, including 10 of Red Duke's calves, and checked them into the holding pens. Then she went into the sale barn to wait. The barn was already filling up. Ranchers in work clothes and cowboy hats, drinking coffee, talking prices, studying the sale catalog. Helen was the only woman in the room. She found a seat on the wooden bleachers and waited. She had a number written on a card, her lot number. When they called it, she would watch her cattle sell, collect her check, and go home. That was the plan. At 10:15, the auctioneer called her lot. 30 head of mixed Hereford cattle from the Marlowe estate, cows, calves, and a few breeding-age heifers. "Let's start the bidding at—" "Hold on." Garrett Holloway stood up from the front row, his voice carrying through the barn. "I'd like to inspect those animals before we start." The auctioneer hesitated. It was an unusual request. Buyers typically inspected livestock before the auction, not during. But Garrett Holloway was Garrett Holloway. "All right, folks, we'll take a short recess. Mr. Holloway wants to look at the Marlowe cattle." Helen felt something cold settle in her stomach. She didn't know Garrett Holloway personally, but she knew his reputation. Jack had warned her about him. She stood up and followed the crowd out to the holding pens. What happened next would replay in her mind for years. Garrett was standing by the pen, surrounded by his cronies, 5 or 6 men who always seemed to be wherever Garrett was. They were looking at her cattle, pointing, talking among themselves. Helen approached them. "Mr. Holloway, I'm Helen Marlowe. Is there a problem with my animals?" Garrett turned to look at her. His eyes traveled slowly from her face to her feet and back again, the way a man looks at livestock, not at a person. Mrs. Marlowe. He tipped his hat, but there was no respect in the gesture. I'm sorry for your loss. Jack was a good man. Thank you. I wanted to make you an offer. Before the auction. Garrett smiled. Save us all some time. An offer for the whole lot. All 30 head. Garrett paused, making a show of calculating. I'll give you, let's say, $40 a head. That's $1,200 cash, right now. No waiting, no uncertainty. Helen blinked. $40 a head was insulting. These were healthy cattle, good breeding stock. The market rate was at least $1,500 a head. More for the calves with superior genetics. Mr. Holloway, these cattle are worth considerably more than that. Are they? Garrett looked at his friends, who chuckled on cue. Sweetheart, I've been in this business for 30 years. I know what cattle are worth, and I know what a widow's cattle are worth. What's that supposed to mean? It means you're not in a position to negotiate. Garrett stepped closer, lowering his voice. You've got bills to pay, don't you? No husband to help you work that land. No experience running a cattle operation on your own. Take my offer, Mrs. Marlowe. It's the best you're going to get. Helen felt her face flush. I'll take my chances at auction. Garrett's smile didn't waver, but something hardened in his eyes. Suit yourself. He turned and walked back toward the sale barn, his entourage following. Helen watched them go, her heart pounding. But the auction was worse than she'd feared. When her cattle came through the ring, the auctioneer started the bidding at $100 a head, a fair opening price, but no one bid. Come on, folks. These are quality animals. Do I hear $100 to start? Silence. Helen looked around the room. The men who had been bidding enthusiastically on other lots were suddenly studying their boots, their coffee cups, anything but the auctioneer. 90? Do I hear 90? Nothing. 80? Come on, people, these are good cattle. Finally, Garrett Holloway raised his paddle. 40. A murmur went through the crowd. $40 was an insult, a joke. The auctioneer looked uncomfortable. I have 40. Do I hear 50? Silence. 45? Nothing. The buyer's ring was holding firm. Going once at $40, going twice. Wait. Helen stood up. Her voice was shaking, but it carried. I'm not selling at that price. I withdraw the lot. Another murmur, louder this time. The auctioneer looked at Garrett, then at Helen. Ma'am, once bidding has started, the bidding hasn't started. One insulting offer isn't bidding. These cattle are worth 10 times that, and everyone in this room knows it. Helen's voice was stronger now. I came here to sell cattle, not to be robbed. If no one will pay fair value, I'll take my animals home and find another way. She started walking toward the exit, her head high, her cheeks burning. That's when Garrett Holloway decided to teach her a lesson. The sale barn opened onto the auction yard, a muddy expanse of churned earth and puddles where trucks and trailers were parked. Helen had to cross it to get to her vehicle. She was halfway across when she heard footsteps behind her. Fast footsteps. Mrs. Marlowe. Garrett's voice was hard now, the false friendliness gone. You're making a mistake. Helen turned. Garrett was right behind her, his cronies spreading out in a loose semicircle. They were between her and the parking lot. I've made my decision, Mr. Holloway. You think you can come into my auction and make a fool of me? Garrett stepped closer. You think you can refuse my offer and walk away? Your offer was theft, and this isn't your auction. Everything in this county is mine, sweetheart. The auction, the feed store, the bank that holds every mortgage for 50 miles. Another step closer. You want to play games? I can make sure nobody in this county does business with you. Nobody buys your cattle, nobody sells you feed, nobody gives you credit. Helen's heart was pounding, but she held her ground. Is that a threat? It's a fact. Garrett smiled. You should have taken the $40, Mrs. Marlowe. Now you're going to get nothing. You're going to lose that farm within the year. And when you do, I'll buy it for pennies. And I'll "That's enough." A new voice. Helen turned to see a man approaching, younger than Garrett. Work clothes, determined expression. It was Thomas Ashford. He had been watching from the edge of the crowd, and he couldn't watch anymore. "Stay out of this, Ashford," Garrett said. "This doesn't concern you. It concerns me when I see 6 men threatening a woman." Thomas positioned himself beside Helen. "Mrs. Marlowe, do you want me to walk you to your truck?" Before Helen could answer, Garrett moved. Later he would claim it was an accident. He would say he was just gesturing, just stepping forward to make a point. But Helen saw his hand come out, saw it connect with her shoulder, saw the world tilt as she lost her footing on the muddy ground. She went down hard, face first into the mud, her black morning dress soaked through instantly, cold muck in her mouth, her hands sinking into the mire as she tried to push herself up. And from somewhere above her, she heard laughter. The men were laughing. Garrett and his friends, standing in their clean boots on the slightly drier ground, laughing at the widow covered in mud. "Careful, Mrs. Marlowe," Garrett said, his voice dripping with mock concern. "It's slippery out here. Maybe you should stay down where you belong." More laughter. Helen felt tears burning in her eyes. Tears of humiliation, of rage, of grief. She was alone in the mud, and every man in sight was laughing at her, and Jack was dead and she had no one and nothing, and here, a hand appeared in front of her face. Not grabbing, not demanding, just offered, palm up, waiting. Helen looked up. Thomas Ashford was kneeling beside her in the mud. His jeans were soaked, his boots covered in muck. He didn't seem to notice or care. His eyes were fixed on hers, and they were kind. "Take my hand," he said quietly. "Let me help you up." Helen reached up and took his hand. He pulled her to her feet gently, steadying her when she swayed. His other hand found her elbow, supporting her. He didn't let go until she was stable. "Are you hurt?" Helen shook her head. She couldn't speak. Thomas turned to face Garrett Holloway. The laughter had stopped. Something in Thomas's expression had silenced it. "You should be ashamed of yourself," Thomas said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "All of you, laughing at a widow in the mud. What kind of men are you?" "The kind that mind our own business," Garrett said, but his voice had lost some of its swagger. "Which you should learn to do, Ashford. This is my business now." Thomas put a hand on Helen's shoulder, protective, not possessive. "Mrs. Marlowe, I'm going to walk you to your truck. Then I'm going to help you load your cattle. And then I'm going to follow you home to make sure you get there safe." "Ashford," Garrett started. And if anyone, Thomas raised his voice, looking at each of the men in turn. "If anyone tries to interfere with this woman's livelihood, I'll know about it. And I'll make sure everyone else knows about it too. The newspapers, the sheriff, the state agricultural board, everyone." Garrett's face had gone red. "You're making an enemy today, son. I've been watching you make enemies for years, Holloway. The difference is, your enemies are too scared to fight back." Thomas met his gaze evenly. "I'm not." He turned back to Helen. "Ma'am, your truck?" Helen nodded, and together they walked across the muddy auction yard, past the silent men, past Garrett Holloway's impotent rage, toward the parking lot and whatever came next. She was still covered in mud. Her dress was ruined, her dignity in tatters. But she wasn't alone anymore. Let me pause here and tell you something about what happens when two people survive something terrible together. Most of the time, nothing happens. You exchange phone numbers, promise to stay in touch, and drift back to your separate lives. The crisis passes, and the connection fades. But sometimes, rarely, preciously, the connection holds. Two people look at each other through the aftermath of a disaster and see something worth holding on to. Thomas Ashford followed Helen home that day. He helped her unload her cattle. He made sure she got inside safely. And then, standing on her porch in his mud-caked clothes, he said, "I know this isn't my business, but do you have anyone helping you with the ranch?" Helen shook her head. "It's just me now." "That's not going to work. Not against Garrett. Not alone." Thomas hesitated, then continued. I could help. Not charity. Business. I've got equipment you don't have. You've got cattle that need tending. Maybe we could work something out. Why would you do that? Thomas looked away, toward the fields, toward the cattle grazing peacefully as if nothing had happened. Because Jack was a good man. Because what happened today was wrong. Because he stopped, started again. Because when I was 12 years old, my father died and people came out of nowhere to help my mother and me. Neighbors, strangers, people who didn't have to care but did anyway. He looked back at Helen. I figure I owe a debt, and I figure you're a good place to start paying it off. Helen studied this man, this stranger who had knelt in the mud beside her, who had faced down Garrett Holloway, who was now offering help with nothing asked in return. All right, she said, but I'm paying you. Whatever the going rate is, I'm not accepting charity. Fair enough, Thomas smiled. It was a good smile, honest and warm. I'll come by tomorrow, we can make a plan. He came by the next day, and the day after that, and gradually, without either of them planning it, Thomas Ashford became a fixture in Helen Marlowe's life. But before the love story could begin, there was work to do, and a secret to uncover. Now let me tell you about the notebook, because this is where everything changed. 3 weeks after the auction yard incident, Thomas was helping Helen clean out Jack's office. She had been putting it off. Every piece of paper, every tool, every trace of her husband felt like a wound. But bills needed to be found, accounts needed to be closed, life needed to go on. Thomas was going through the desk drawers when he found it. Helen. He held up a worn leather notebook. What's this? Helen looked up from the papers she was sorting. I don't. Wait. Her eyes widened. Jack's breeding records. I forgot all about that. Thomas opened the notebook and began to read. His face changed as he flipped through the pages. Helen, do you know what Red Duke is? Our bull. Jack paid too much for him, but he said, he was right. Thomas looked up, his eyes bright with excitement. These numbers, Helen, this bull is exceptional, possibly one of the best breeding animals in the state. The weight gain on these calves, the consistency, he shook his head in disbelief. Garrett Holloway knew. That's why he wanted your cattle so badly. He knew what Red Duke was worth. How much? The bull himself? $20,000, maybe $30,000 to the right buyer. But that's not the real value. Thomas tapped the notebook. The real value is his genetics. If you keep breeding him, build a reputation, document the results, in 10 years, you could be selling breeding stock to ranchers all over the Midwest. Premium prices, thousands per head. Helen stared at the notebook, at Jack's careful handwriting, his meticulous records, his vision for their future. He never told me it was this valuable. He probably wanted to wait until he was sure. Thomas handed her the notebook. But he was sure. Look at these projections. He was planning to build everything around this bull. He saw the future, Helen. He just didn't get to live it. Helen held the notebook to her chest. She could almost hear Jack's voice, patient and warm, explaining his plans while she half listened, thinking about dinner or laundry or 100 other things that seemed important at the time. She should have listened more closely. She should have asked more questions. She should have... Helen. Thomas's voice was gentle. He left this for you. The knowledge, the records, the plan. He gave you everything you need to build something extraordinary. All you have to do is follow through. I don't know how to build a breeding operation. I don't either. But we can learn together. Thomas smiled. If you'll let me help. Helen looked at this man, this stranger who had become something more, though neither of them had named it yet. She thought about the mud and the laughter and the hand that had pulled her to her feet. All right, she said. Let's build something. And that's exactly what they did. Let me tell you about the next 10 years, because this is where patience became power. 1975 to 1977 were the hardest years. Helen was learning the breeding business from scratch, making mistakes, sometimes losing money. Thomas was there through all of it, helping with the work, sharing his equipment, offering advice but never pushing. Their relationship grew slowly, carefully. Both of them had reasons to be cautious. Helen was still grieving. Thomas was wary of seeming opportunistic. For 2 years they were partners, friends, something more than neighbors but less than lovers. Then, one evening in the spring of 1978, Helen invited Thomas to stay for dinner. They sat on her porch afterward, watching the sun set over the cattle grazing peacefully in the field. "I've been thinking," Helen said. "About what?" "About Jack." She took a breath. "He would have liked you. He would have wanted me to move on, to be happy." Thomas didn't say anything. He just waited. "I think I'm ready to move on," Helen said, "if you're interested." Thomas turned to look at her. In the fading light, his face was unreadable. "Helen Marlowe," he said slowly, "I've been interested since the moment I knelt in that mud beside you. I just didn't think you'd ever—" She kissed him before he could finish. They were married in October of 1980, in the same church where Helen had married Jack 8 years earlier. The wedding was small, just family and a few friends. Thomas moved into Helen's farmhouse, and they combined their operations into one. And Red Duke kept producing exceptional calves. By 1983, the Ashford Marlowe Ranch, they kept both names, had built a reputation that reached far beyond Lancaster County. Ranchers from Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado were calling to ask about breeding stock. Article in Nebraska Farmer magazine called Red Duke one of the most valuable breeding bulls in the state. The prices reflected it. Calves that would have sold for $150 at auction in 1975 were now selling for $800, even a $1,500 to buyers who wanted Red Duke's genetics in their herds. And while Helen and Thomas were building, Garrett Holloway was borrowing. Let me tell you about the crash, because this is where the wheel turned. The farm crisis of the 1980s hit cattle ranchers hard. Land values plummeted. Interest rates soared. Ranchers who had expanded aggressively during the boom years found themselves drowning in debt. Garrett Holloway had expanded more aggressively than anyone. By 1984, he owed more than $2 million to various banks and creditors. His 3,000 acres, which had been worth $2,000 per acre at the peak, were now valued at less than $800. He was underwater, owing more than his assets were worth. The banks started calling. Then they started threatening. Then they started foreclosing. One by one, Garrett's properties went up for auction. The same auction yard where he had pushed Helen into the mud became the site of his own humiliation, as pieces of his empire were sold off to pay his debts. And Helen watched it all from a distance, running her thriving breeding operation, building something sustainable on the foundation of Jack's vision and Thomas's partnership. She didn't gloat. She didn't even attend the auctions. She just kept working, kept building, kept proving that the men who had laughed at her were wrong. Then, in the summer of 1986, Garrett Holloway came to her door. Let me tell you about that meeting, because this is where the story reaches its climax. Helen was in the barn when Thomas came to get her. "There's someone here to see you," he said. His voice was strange, tight, controlled. "Who?" "Garrett Holloway." Helen went still. For a moment she was back in that muddy auction yard, face down in the muck, listening to laughter. "What does he want?" "He says he needs to buy a bull." Helen walked to the house. Garrett was standing on the porch, the same porch where Thomas had first offered to help all those years ago. But he wasn't the same man who had pushed her into the mud. He was diminished. His expensive clothes were gone, replaced by worn jeans and a faded jacket. His face was thinner, older, marked by stress and failure. He held his hat in his hands, turning it nervously. "Mrs. Ash, Mrs. Marlowe." He stumbled over the name. "Thank you for seeing me. It's Mrs. Ashford now, and I haven't agreed to see you yet." Helen stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at him. "What do you want?" Garrett swallowed hard. "I need to buy a bull, a good one. My breeding program is shot. I lost most of my herd in the crash. I'm trying to rebuild, but I need quality genetics, and everyone says," he trailed off. "Everyone says what?" "Everyone says your bulls are the best in the state." Helen let the silence stretch out. She thought about everything this man had done. The buyer's ring, the threats, the push that had sent her into the mud. She thought about the laughter, the humiliation, the years of struggle. She thought about the woman she had been, face down in the muck, and the woman she had become. "I remember the last time we did business, Mr. Holloway. You offered me $40 a head for cattle worth 4 times that. You threatened to destroy me, and when I refused to be bullied, you pushed me into the mud and laughed." Garrett's face went red, then white. "That was 11 years ago. I've spent every day since then building something you said I couldn't build. A widow alone. That's what you called me. Not in a position to negotiate." Helen climbed the porch steps, putting herself at eye level with him. "Look at me now, Mr. Holloway. Look at what the widow built." Garrett couldn't meet her eyes. "I was wrong. I know that now. I was cruel and stupid and wrong." "Yes, you were." Helen studied him, this broken man who had once seemed so powerful. "Do you know what I wanted all those years? I wanted you to fail. I wanted to watch you lose everything the way you tried to make me lose everything. I wanted revenge." Garrett flinched but didn't speak. "But then I realized something." Helen's voice softened, just slightly. "Revenge wouldn't give me back what I lost. It wouldn't bring Jack back. It wouldn't undo the mud, or the laughter, or the humiliation. All revenge would do is turn me into you." She looked at him steadily. "I don't want to be you, Mr. Holloway. I want to be better than you." "Does that mean?" "It means I'll sell you a bull. Fair price, same as I'd charge anyone else, but I want something in return." "What?" "An apology. A real one. Not here, where no one can see, at the county livestock auction. In front of everyone. You're going to stand up and tell people what you did to me, and then you're going to tell them that you were wrong." Garrett's face contorted. For a moment Helen thought he would refuse, that his pride, even now, would be stronger than his need. Then his shoulders slumped. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll do it." 2 weeks later, at the Lancaster County Summer Livestock Auction, Garrett Holloway stood up in front of 100 ranchers and told them about the buyer's ring, about the lowball offers to widows, about the day he pushed Helen Marlowe into the mud and laughed while she lay there. "I was wrong," he said, his voice barely carrying to the back rows. "I was cruel and greedy and wrong. Helen Marlowe, Helen Ashford, built something I couldn't destroy. She's a better rancher than I ever was, and a better person too. I'm sorry for what I did. I'm sorry I wasn't man enough to say it sooner." He sat down. The room was silent. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, someone started clapping. Others joined in. Not applause for Garrett. Applause for Helen. For justice, for the turning of the wheel. Helen sat beside Thomas, his hand warm in hers, and let the tears come. "Let me end this story where it began. In the mud of an auction yard, with a hand reaching down. Helen Ashford is 79 years old now. Thomas passed away in 2018 after 43 years of marriage, years filled with hard work, with laughter, with grandchildren who learned to ride horses on the same land where Helen once lay face down in the mud. The ranch is run by their daughter now, and by her husband and children. The Ashford Marlowe name is still respected throughout Nebraska and beyond. Red Duke has been gone for decades, but his genetics live on in thousands of animals across the Midwest. Helen doesn't go to auctions anymore. Her knees aren't what they used to be, and the noise bothers her. But every spring, on the anniversary of that terrible day in 1975, she asks her grandson to drive her to the Lancaster County sale barn. She doesn't go inside. She just sits in the truck, looking at the auction yard paved now, no more mud, and remembers. She remembers the cruelty. She remembers the laughter. She remembers lying in the mud, believing that her life was over. And she remembers the hand. "Grandma," her grandson asked once, "what are you thinking about?" Helen smiled. "I'm thinking about your grandfather, about the day he knelt in the mud beside me and offered to help. That's when you fell in love with him. That's when I learned something important." Helen looked at her grandson, This boy who would never know what it felt like to be pushed down and laughed at, because his family would always be there to lift him up. I learned that cruelty isn't as strong as it looks. I learned that one person standing up can change everything. And I learned, her voice caught, but she kept going. I learned that the people who laugh at you don't define you. The people who help you up, they define you. And you define yourself, her grandson said, by what you do next. Helen reached over and squeezed his hand. That's exactly right. That's exactly what I learned. She looked out at the auction yard one more time, at the place where she had lost everything and found everything, where she had been pushed down and had risen up, where a stranger's hand had become a husband's hand and a lifetime of love. Take me home, she said. I've seen enough. The truck pulled away, leaving the auction yard behind. But the memory remained of mud and laughter and one person brave enough to help. That's all it takes, sometimes. One person, one hand, one moment of kindness in a world that can be so cruel. Helen Marlowe found that hand when she needed it most, and she spent the rest of her life being that hand for others.